welcome again to this webinar. I want to give you a quick introduction of the platform so that you know where you can find all the functionalities that you need to follow the presentation. First of all, you can select the language that you want to listen to in the lower bar where it says your language. You can select either French or Spanish or English. If you understand all three of the languages, you can just remain on the floor channel. To interact with the presenters or write down questions or remarks, I invite you to use the chat below my finger here. There's been some interaction on there already. So you can write your messages there. If a message is written in a language that you don't understand, please hover over the message with your mouse and a button will appear that says translate. If you click it, the message will be translated into the language of your choice. I will now pass the floor to Patricia to give a brief introduction. Patricia, when you're ready to pass the floor, please say over to you, and then I can pass the floor. So over to you, Patricia.
Thank you so much, Maika, for giving us the technical introduction. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the co-focal points of the Women and Gender constituency, who are Bridget Burns and Tibile Mokoena, who also wanted to speak but have at the moment a small technical issue, so we hope that they will be able to join later on. So on behalf of them, I would just like to give you a quick introduction into the Women and Gender constituency, which is the official observer group within the UNFCCC. And we have started a capacity building webinar series ahead of COP25 to let you know what our feminist demands are beforehand, and also to make sure that everyone who is joining COP or is interested in international climate policies is knowing what is going on. The COP has taken place, as you all know, in December. In the first 2 weeks, having an extensive overtime, actually, until it finalized. And then finally, now we are already about 5 weeks after the finalization of COP and try to quickly get into our work, as probably all of you. The reason that we are doing a webinar today is that we had the feeling that it's not only necessary to look beforehand at what has happened, but also give a feminist analysis of the COP, and in particular because we had this quite difficult circumstances where the COP was cancelled to take place in Santiago de Chile and was then organized on a very short notice in Madrid. And what we would like to do, not only to give you a feminist analysis today, but also to make sure that you know what has happened in parallel to COP in the civil society spaces in Madrid, but also in Santiago in the first and in the second week. So our agenda for today is that we will look at the demands for the negotiations and outcomes, have a feminist reflection on what has happened at COP25, but also what has happened around the COP and since then, and then having a closer look on the feminist and civil society actions in Madrid and Santiago de Chile. And for this, we have our two great speakers, who are Melissa Moreano from Ecuador and Antonia Zambra, who is from Chile, and will talk about the civil society actions in Chile during COP later on. For the moment, I would like to start with you to take you back on the journey on how we started COP25 last year, and remember of the starting period, actually. So remember that COP25 was actually supposed to take place under Brazilian presidency, and they took back their offer after the governmental changes they were going through in 2018, so that Chile was actually taking over the presidency together with Costa Rica, so to say, that organized the pre-COP in Costa Rica. And after weeks of social protests in Chile, the COP was cancelled to take place in Santiago only 5 weeks ahead of COP, which pushed pretty much everyone into a big crisis that planned to join the climate conference, and naturally produced a lot of problems, in particular for civil society and for the smaller NGOs, because travels and logistics were all settled and paid, and many organizations and individuals had quite big problems to get a refund of the costs they had already spent, which naturally then changed the nature of participants that were able to come to COP, and also changed, of course, the entire surrounding, because civil society in Chile had already prepared for many alternative events around the conference, and finally decided to, nevertheless the COP was cancelled, still organized the events that were organized already. This should also make us remember that finally this was the 4th COP within 5 years that took place in an EU country. From the negotiations point of view, the COP25 was rather a in-between COP, so to say. It was after the work program of the Paris Agreement was finalized in Katowice one year earlier, and then also 1 year ahead of the COP26 in 2020, when we expect a update of the nationally determined contributions. Nevertheless, there were a couple of important negotiation topics that I will go through later on, or in just a minute, but the other surroundings, so to say, of this COP was that there were 3 special IPCC reports published, one on the 1.5 degree, one on climate change and land, and then also on the ocean and cryosphere, both last year in 2019. And at the same time, we see a rising civil society movement and climate justice movement led by youth, but also joined by many other social movements that are putting all our focus on the climate emergency that we are in, and which are also presented by the 3 IPCC reports I was just referring to. And what we have seen now is that not only that we did not have a Latin American COP, but also that we missed, for example, the chance of promoting the ratification of the Esquazú Agreement that promotes public participation in environmental decision-making and also protects those who defend the environment, and also to, actually pay attention to the climate emergency we are in, because the outcomes of COP were generally rather disappointing. But as we are a civil society, or many of us are, we would actually like to have a bigger discussion later on about the question of what are our next steps for building more collective actions in the context of an increasing climate emergency. So let's look a little bit closer into the focus of this COP. We, and by we I mean not only the Women and Gender Constituency, but also our wider network of feminists and women and LGBTIQ NGC folks, organizations, journalists, researchers, and activists that are all there to support our demands and also push the negotiations into the direction to actually recognize the climate emergency we are in, and make governments really being committed to the climate action that we need. We do know that the negotiations usually do not recognize the emergency or have not done so in the past years, and also have ignored that climate action should be human-centered, because this is what we want to preserve, a planet where human can have a good life on, as well as a world where biodiversity and ecosystems are preserved. So the space for alternatives that already exist and make a positive change already for people and their lives should be actually more on the center of the negotiations, despite we are rather seeing a focus on what business and industries are actually doing, even though they might be the most dirtiest ones. So therefore our focal topics during the COP are already presented on the slide, but were, amongst others, of course, the prolongation of the Lima Work Programme that is looking at gender-just climate action and a robust gender action plan. We also wanted countries to deliver on ambition in the lead-up of an NDC update that we expect in 2020, and also commit to climate finance, in particular a commitment from the industrialized countries, of course. As there was the finalization of the review of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, we also wanted to see mechanisms that effectively address loss and damages and also take into consideration climate-induced migration. Another focus, of course, was, as for all others, Article 6, but our feminist demand is to rather not rely on the markets and reduce emissions with other means, which I will go into later on, as we have seen that market mechanisms have not contributed in a way that we need, and they also have caused human rights violations. And we have not seen that the solutions presented have actually, or the negotiations have learned from the lessons in the past. Our other demand was also to preserve the oceans and biodiversity and ecosystems that are vulnerable to human exploitations, but also in particular to climate change. And of course also to, now as the local communities indigenous peoples platform is almost, or is operationalized to really kick off implementation. So looking at the outcome and also on our demands that we originally had for Article 6. So just to remind everyone, Article 6 refers to the voluntary international cooperation to implement NDCs. Thereof, it has three parts. One part are international transferred mitigation outcomes, which allow for cooperative approaches. Then the Sustainable Development Mechanism, which is Article 6.4 and would follow CDM and JI, joint implementation. And then third, non-market approaches that are unfortunately greatly lagging behind the other two negotiation streams. And as I have already said, the feminist critique from our side is that cooperative approaches have so far not contributed to a mitigation or emission reductions that we need or we needed to see until the last decade. And this is why, from a feminist perspective, we rather look at solutions that support a radical transformation from polluting forms of energy and very exploitative economic systems to set clear goals and deadlines to end fossil fuel use and other unsustainable forms of energy production, and rather enhance renewable, community-based and sustainable energies that are owned and accessible to all, and that take into account gendered needs, which we do not see in market approaches very often, unfortunately. And even so, the COP was prolonged until Sunday. There was no outcome on this article, which is rather seen as a good outcome from civil society perspective, because the governments that urged to get to a conclusion on Article 6 were then willing to give up on the support of human rights and safeguards for human rights and indigenous peoples, and also on the redress mechanisms rather quickly, which would have been the opposite from learning from the past, and which was largely opposed by civil society organizations, in particular, for example, from Women and Gender, but also from the Indigenous Peoples Caucus. And then, of course, we also have other bigger issues, for example, looking at the transfer of old CDM credits, for example, and also double counting, which would not lead actually to an overall emission reduction, or would actually cause big loopholes, which we definitely want to avoid. Then by initiative of Costa Rica, there was a group of countries that committed to the San Jose principles, and it was quickly joined by many parties and governments, and will probably be a basis for the further negotiations going on. However, even in this regard, and even so, there are many countries in this coalition that support human rights, and human rights safeguards. They are not part of those principles. So,
Patricia, just a second. I just wanted to let you know that apparently there was a technical issue that we think we can resolve quite quickly, just to let Bridget in and to give your voice a break. So to everyone listening, we're going to pause the event for a second and reboot, and we'll be right back, Patricia, if that's okay with you. And I'm sorry for interrupting. So we'll just pausing the event for a second. Please don't leave, and we will be right back. See you in a bit. We are back. I will ask you all to please refresh. Please do that now. In the meantime, I'm going to pass the floor to Bridget. So Bridget, this is a slide where Patricia stopped talking before we paused, and I'm going to reach out to Patricia, Antonia, and Mel so that they can connect again. But in the meantime, let me pass the floor to you, Bridget, and I will reach out to Patricia, Mel, and Antonia while you're presenting. Okay, so over to you, Bridget.
Thank you. It's great to be on the call with everyone again. This section of the presentation was something that Patricia was leading on, and having just joined the call, I'm not quite sure at what point she was at, so I would love to pass back to Patricia if she's there. And yes, I'm sorry that I wasn't with you on the call earlier. I think like many of you, we had some trouble coming into the call from the beginning. So Mike, I'm going to pass back to you so you can give it to Patricia.
Waiting for Patricia to reconnect. I see that Antonia is already there, and we're just waiting for Patricia and Mel to reconnect again. So if you don't mind, Bridget, can I give it over to you maybe, and we move to the next part or the previous part, so that I can get through to Patricia and have her reconnect. Please, over to you, Bridget.
Sure. I'm really sorry about this, everyone. As mentioned, I am not quite sure where we're at in this presentation, but I will do my best to figure out something to do while we wait for Patricia. I am going to move past these demands pieces where I believe Patricia was going through from Article 6, and I'm going to jump into an overview of the Lima Work Programme on gender and what we went into the COP looking for in terms of outcomes for the Lima Work Programme on gender, and then what we got. I also see that there are many more people on the call than there was when we first started, so I think perhaps a number of people were having some trouble, so thank you for joining now. So certainly the Lima Work Programme on gender and its gender action plan was a key focus area for us for most of last year in terms of engagement with the workshops that were happening, engagement in the submissions. We as a constituency put forward a very concrete proposal in terms of what outcomes we would like to see in an enhanced gender action plan. And I think that for us, it was about we certainly wanted to see something that would be longer than 2 years. So something that would last for a 5-year period. And we definitely wanted to see a combined Lima Work Programme and gender action plan that would help us to streamline efforts and have a really clear picture of what we were trying to achieve by the end. And I think for us, we also wanted to see some very clear targets and indicators that we could measure progress against. And so I'm just going to go to the next slide. And I think it was interesting because for many of you who were at the COP, you would know that even under these negotiations where I think we had seen a lot of really strong political will amongst all parties, to have a strong outcome under the GAP, there was still very contentious negotiations. And I think this is actually just part and parcel with the fact that the gender negotiations, as someone who's watched every single one on gender, used to be a negotiation room where maybe 20 parties were sitting, and very few governments were putting a lot of political weight behind what discussions were happening there. But now, you consistently see representation of 70 plus parties, including the major negotiating blocs, who, take this agenda item very seriously, which I think is a positive thing. It also is a challenge because once a negotiation stream, has so much participation from across different negotiating blocs, there's also the potential that, like everything in this process, it becomes a bargaining chip for a lot of other issues. And I think what we saw happening in some contexts under the gender negotiations is the same issues that plague other aspects. So whether or not we're going to see concrete finance to support the gender action plan became a huge sticking point for many negotiators under this item who wanted to see very specific language on access to finance, particularly to be able to implement some of these pieces of work, such as enhancing gender-responsive national climate policies or building the capacity of national gender and climate change focal points. We also saw some of the same issues that plagued the entire negotiations around language on human rights, language on just transition, which is a real shame because these are all this is all language that had been agreed under the Lima Work Programme and the Gender Action Plan previously. But all of that suffice to say, I definitely think that at COP25, the strongest outcome that we got from the entire process was the enhanced Gender Action Plan and Lima Work Programme, which was decided as a 5-year work program. It did in the end include some references and echoes back to the finance negotiations. So there were groups of developing country parties that at least saw a callback to some of their key issues in trying to link the work that's being done under the GAP to finance. And there was also the retainment of language on just transition and human rights that was being pushed for in the action plan. And then I think in the action plan itself, if you look at what it is now, which is this very large table, the Gender Action Plan of activities under the same priority areas that have been set out in the first Gender Action Plan, with very explicit sort of outcomes, outputs, and who is expected to deliver on them. What we didn't achieve and get to, and I think it was a challenge that we would have potentially gotten to it, but we didn't get to anything that would put in, for example, a target. So one of the things we had pushed for was that we wanted to see an increase in women's participation, which could be measured like a 4% to 5% increase year on year. And we still remain in a very kind of broad, we want to see the gradual advancement of gender balance towards the goal of gender balance, for example. We also had hoped that we could have indicators around national gender responsive climate policy. So an X number of countries who have developed policies so that we would have, again, something to measure against. But we didn't see that. I don't think that it's without, outside of the scope of the kind of work that we're going to do, we will create those kinds of baselines. But if I could see one area where we didn't really achieve progress, it would be in that really drilled down specific space. But then again, I think that it was always going to be challenging to have that from the UNFCCC process. I think that in comparison to the original GAP, we're certainly pushing farther in our understanding of the different types of capacity building that is needed. There was a lot in terms of trying to see advancements happening at national level. There was really great language on a focus on local and traditional knowledge, on strengthening the leadership and the solutions of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women. There was really good language around, gender responsive technologies, but also around enhancing the capacity for national gender and climate change focal points, which was another sticky issue because some countries really wanted a very defined terms of reference for what these focal points should be doing, what their job is, while other countries wanted a very loose definition that countries themselves could make up. And I think that there's very clear interests on both sides there, both of which in the end are about being able to do that role, but coming from different positions of what it means in different country contexts to actually take on that role. And so I think one of the things to put on your agenda upcoming is that in June, that's going to be one of the focus areas of the workshop that's happening, which is to try to really understand and enhance that role. And I think that this is something for our network and our constituency, as we have been doing, working with countries, getting their feedback and understanding how they're envisioning this role and what ways we can support or uplift different case studies on that. I guess the last thing I'll say on the Lima Work Programme is that there was also a real push to enhance the collection of sex and gender disaggregated data, to link gender experts and intersectional data on gender and climate change to the science and research platforms under the UNFCCC, including the IPCC. So I think that was another strong area in terms of advancing what we had in the previous GAP. I think that, and I'm sorry that these slides that I'm going through now, I didn't go through before, are just kind of looking at some of the additions, as I mentioned, in terms of what we see in this new GAP and what the areas for improvement are. But I'm going to leave it at that for now, and I'm very happy to come back if there are questions, and I see that there are already some. So I think that what I'll do is pass back to Patricia to continue going through what she was going through, and then we can come back to this piece if there are specific questions on the GAP and next steps forward.
Okay, thank you so much, Bridget. I also needed a moment to realize that I have to refresh, so I hope everyone has no less technical problems as before. Thanks so much for handing or taking over for the part of the Gender Action Plan. I will now go back quickly to my slides, but leave it a little bit shorter than it was originally planned, that we can have a more fruitful discussion later on. So just to conclude what I had said on Article 6 is that as we have no decision here and it will be further negotiated, we must keep in mind that countries already start to implement cooperative approaches and market mechanisms. So no matter if there will be actually an international agreement on the rules of Article 6, there will be definitely the solutions of Article 6 be in use within the Paris Agreement. So from this perspective, we must make sure that we continue our advocacy for strong human rights and indigenous people safeguards, make sure that there will be a redress mechanism, even so we do not agree overall with the emphasis on those kind of solutions. So leaving it with Article 6 here, I would quickly go through what has happened on oceans in COP25 and then also quickly what has happened on loss and damage, and then hand over to the overall picture again. So the COP25 was supposed to be, or was announced to be, a blue COP, and as I said, there was the special report of the IPCC on oceans, and therefore, there were a lot of, or numerous events on oceans and climate change going on during the COP, and also looking at how it can be included in NDC updates and how it can be linked. But it was a little bit worrying to see that a lot of discussions and events were going on about ocean geoengineering and technical fix, instead of looking at how human-related activities actually influence and degrade oceans and seas, and also to have a further look actually on how existing solutions and communities that are actually depending on oceans can be taken into account in a better way. So what we have is the bigger recognition that of the oceans and ecosystems around oceans and how they are affected by climate change. So the outcome was a dialogue on oceans and climate change that will take place during the next intersessionals. And as I said, there was a strong recognition of the meaning of oceans, but we have to closely look at how the negotiations and how the discourse is actually developing and evolving, and how we can actually make sure that also here we make sure that actually those dependent on oceans are taken into account, and that destructive human activities are reduced on oceans. So this is actually also overall true if you are looking at other ecosystems and biodiversity. So this entire package of topics will be actually in the focus of this year and ongoing negotiations. So having said that, I would also quickly like to look at what had happened on the topic of loss and damage and climate-induced migration. And the COP25, even so it was the finalization of the review of the Warsaw Mechanism, this topic was kind of sidelined, looking at the prominent part the Article 6 negotiations actually took on. Even so, of course, a lot of countries that are in particular that are already affected quite largely from losses and damages, and which are most vulnerable to climate impacts, have strongly pushed to have a big focus on it, and also to make sure that we have a more prominent role of those in their negotiations with the standing alone standing alone agenda item, and also by making sure that there is a financial mechanism created that would support losses and damages not only on extreme weather events that are suddenly occurring, but also those that are slowly occurring over time, which are often not actually taken care of or cannot benefit from the emergency finances that are often provided for destructive events that are taking place. So the fact that finances were actually, of course, or are always a difficult topic throughout all negotiation streams, we're making also those negotiations again very difficult and also highly contested, also looking at human rights issues, as Bridget already described in the gender negotiations, made the development of the negotiations on loss and damages very difficult. Nevertheless, we have an outcome that established an expert group on actions and support, and it was only recognized actually that finances and means of finances, for example, from the GCF must be made available, and you have to have a stronger look into how those existing instruments will be able to support also loss and damages. What we have, of course, or unfortunately also seen is that climate-induced migration has not gotten a more prominent role within the negotiations and will be further or will be continuously put under the loss and damage or mentioned only in the loss and damage negotiations, which we will come back actually later on when we are looking what is happening around the negotiations and see how the negotiations also in this regard fail to actually realize the outside world or the climate emergency recognized by other actors and governance. So having said this, I would like to give back to Bridget to look at the bigger picture and maybe answer some questions on the gender action plan.
So I'm not going to go into the gender action plan piece now. And again, I apologize because I'm just joining. I'm not quite sure if our other presenters have gone yet, but I would love to move straight to them if possible. And as Micah said, we have questions that are pieces here that I think we can come back to the big picture piece and come back to those questions as well. So
sure that I understood you correctly. You want to move on to Antonia now?
Okay. Great, thank you.
Pass it over to you. You'll have to advance the slides until your bit of the presentation. And again, feel free to speak Spanish. Just make sure that you have the Spanish channel selected and everything will be translated back into the other languages. So over to you, Antonia.
Hola, ¿se escucha? Voy a dar tiempo de ajustar, pero...
Sorry, we're having some technical problems, but I'm getting Antonia now, so she's asking for the presentation. Can you please show the presentation and send? Please, I'm still waiting. Sí, si no te importa, perdona, Antonia, voy a pasar todas las diapositivas para poder así cerrarla y poder abrirla de Antonia. Sentimos la espera.
Her part of the presentation. So again, over to you, Antonia, and to the interpreters, please interpret into English on the English channel. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Bueno, me excuso también por hablar en español esta vez.
For using Spanish. This time I'd like to tell you about some updates about the protests that took place recently in Chile. Up to now, as Patricia mentioned. Yes, Patricia made reference to, said that one of the main reasons why the Santiago de Chile COP was cancelled were the social explosion, the important protests that took place in November 19. That was a response to a general disconform against the deep inequalities we're facing in Chile, in our country, right now, for the current development model. So we, the feminists, play a very important role. Right now, social movements and mobilizations continue in Chile, and also systematic violations of the human rights by the Chilean police. Since October last year, there were complex and situations of sexual abuses by police forces, according to the National Institute of Human Rights. On January 15th this year, they had recorded 191 complaints of sexual violence, including exposing, groping, threats and insults, and also for rapes up to this moment. Apart from that, last Wednesday, January 29th, the Movement for Homosexual Liberation denounced to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights 23 cases of police abuses against people belonging to LGBTI groups with transphobic character. It's important to mention that apart from that, in November last year, the government reached an agreement with the opposition parties to initiate a process to renovate the constitution of our country.
Has not managed to establish what are the mechanisms enabling equal representation of gender and a proportional representation of indigenous peoples in the country. And also it's important to note that it's been confirmed that the independent candidates will be present during the constitutional process, and this Tuesday, 28th of January, it's been recorded in the Electoral Service of Chile, the first feminist party made up of almost 900 women and inspired by the initiative of the thesis that has been known worldwide. On the 26th of April this year, we will have a referendum where the citizens will decide for the change in the constitutions and under what mechanism it will be drafted. This is the general overview of the situation of the social outburst. So in terms of the debate after the COP25 at national level, on the 14th of January, the Ministry of Environment of Chile, Carolina Schmidt, attended a Q&A session about the role of Chile in the presidency of the summit, and particularly their negotiating position during the climate agreements. During the Q&A, the minister defended herself, saying that the government is not satisfied with the outcomes of the COP, but 7 out of the 8 goals of Chile were reached, and that it was only a failure of the objective number 8 about the purchase and sale of carbon credits. The minister and the Piñera government defend themselves, arguing that the agreements were not reached during the summit, during the conference, because they needed the unanimous agreement of the parties, and it was the large countries who denied the success of this. This really makes us think, because this is a narrative that it's against the action of a government that in terms of environment it's far from being successful. Up until now, Chile doesn't want to ratify the Escazú treatment, and the minister is justifying herself, and I quote her, Chile it's complying with all the requirements of Iguazu, so it doesn't have to be signed. And this puts in risk the country, and these are the words of the minister. It says that it puts a risk of internationalizing conflicts that should be internal. So now let's move on to the next one. My apologies, because I'm trying to find my slide. Anyway, the image from the previous slide was in connection to the activities of civil society, the ones that were carried out at the same time as the COP, even though the COP25 happened in Madrid, as Patricia and Bridget has mentioned. They were activities in Chile. There were two specific actions. One was the People's Summit, and the other one was the Social Summit for Climate Justice. As you can see in the image here, this is the Social Summit for Climate Justice, and Mel will give you more details about it. I was there, and this activity took place between the 2nd and the 13th of December in Santiago. It was well received, and it was well organized in terms of planning, but we do believe, however, that it didn't have the participation levels that we expected, obviously because it was in a location that was difficult to access for civil society, and also because there was an overlapping of activities during the People's Summit. So instead of joining forces, there was a weakening of participation, because there were two things happening at the same time. In the Social Summit for Climate Action, there was one day dedicated to women. We were there as the Inequalities Observatory. However, I think what Mel will tell you is quite important. So amongst the most relevant milestones during the summit, we should highlight the drafting and presentation of the Latin American Manifesto for the Climate, which was simultaneously launched on the 9th of December in Madrid and in Cerrillos, which is the place where the Social Summit for Climate Action was taking place. In the drafting of the manifesto, we had the participation of several organizations across the region, and they sent conclusions to position the main climatic demands of each region, each municipality, to make visible the vision of the world in which we want to live and the actions that have to be taken to achieve this vision, with a particular note in public debate and decision making in terms of environment and ecology. I would like to give the floor to Mel now, so that she can tell us about the People's Summit and the Women's Tent. I would like to tell you that we are facing difficulties as social organization. We face difficulties in being cohesioned, in being together, because we see that in Chile there are spaces, in particular by trade union leaders, that are putting obstacles. My apologies. Mis disculpas, voy a dar...
I will go right back to you in a minute. So just to give Mel a heads up, as soon as Antonia is done, I will pass over straight to you. And Mel, just for everyone's understanding, Mel will be speaking Spanish as well. So you'll get to listen to our fantastic interpreters. So back over to you, Antonia.
Apologies. I'm still here. Just wanted to sum up by saying that this year's task is to strengthen the spaces so that the feminist voice is heard. You've got the floor, Mel. Hello, good morning to me and good afternoon to many of you. Thank you very much for being here today in this webinar. I was called to talk about my participation in the People's Summit in Santiago de Chile. As Patricia was saying, Maike, maybe you can put my presentation up, please. Sí, por supuesto.
To just move forward the slides by just clicking the next button. So back over to you, Mel.
Parece que
So I'm sorry, Mel. It appears that you lost connection for a minute there, but over to you. This is your slide. Feel free to move it forward during the presentation.
Great. Good afternoon to everyone around the world. I was invited to participate here because I had the opportunity to be present at the People's Summit in Santiago de Chile. Let me see how to change the slide. So this is my presentation, Feminist Actions during the People's Summit. As Patricia was saying, the change of location from Chile to Madrid really changed the nature of participants during the COP25. And this also changed the People's Summit in Santiago. Chilean civil society decided to keep on doing this People's Summit. I wanted to be very brief because we've talked about this in the Latin American context. As you may know, these international events such as the COP tend to be a platform for the peoples and civil society to put the spotlight on what's happening in different regions around the world. Latin America lost in a way the opportunity to show what's happening in our regions. And you can read it here. We are going through popular uprisings against the neoliberal model. In Chile, this is a very prominent. We've also experienced fires in the Amazon region that put the spotlight on climate change everywhere around the world. Also, we are experiencing the rise of racist and anti-feminist governments, and we are seeing the emergence of consistent social groups. We are seeing the rejection, the direct rejection against feminism, and this is becoming stronger in Latin America. We have a context of extreme violence against environmentalists and those who fight climate change, and we are seeing a growing number of feminicides and gender-related acts of violence across the whole region. As I was saying, the change of the location was also interpreted as the loss of an international platform to talk about these topics. So that's why the civil society tried to keep some actions going on. We had the People's Summit, which was organized in Santiago. It took place during the first week of the COP25 from the 2nd to the 7th of December, and it took place in the University of Santiago de Chile, which is one of the most central locations in Santiago. Whereas the other summit, the social summit, took a place closer to where the COP was going to take place, which is not in the center of the city. We had a very feminist summit. Here you can see the opening ceremony, where a dance group at some point showed these placards where you can see and read the most common mottos that we can hear in feminist protests, which is the defense of bodies and the abortion of the patriarchy. So what topics were addressed? Well, given the situation in Chile, there was much conversation about the constitutional change, and we also talked about bringing into public ownership water. We talked about nature and about the absolute need of making structural changes given the violence of the current system, especially the free trade agreements, which have an impact on peoples and are at the bottom of climate change. This was highlighting the importance of the local knowledge and traditional knowledge, and we wanted to see this local knowledge to face climate change, and there was an emphasis on work and on extractivism, especially fossil fuels and minerals, because Chile is well known for its mining activities. As Antonia was saying, from the 2nd to the 7th of December, we had the Women's Tent. It was a space organized by feminist organizations, where the topics were the ones listed in this slide. As you can see, a topic that is very present in Latin America is structural violence. It is something that we are talking about all the time, that should be present in all discussions. And as I was saying, the significant topics during the feminist conversations were the confirmation that the liberalism and extractivism are at the bottom of the climate crisis, so that we need to fight extractivism. And there was a highlight on the work done by women, both productive and reproductive, and this work to try and reach a fair and just transition. We also talked about the link between gender violence, structural gender violence, and the patriarchy. We also danced the thesis dance. These are the elements that are important for me from the final declaration of the Women's Tent. The acknowledgement of the fact that women are in the front line. Also the impact of the multinationals and the transnational capital on women. Also the confirmation that we are living under structural violence and feminicide. Also highlighting that rural and popular feminism are the solution, and they are linked to agroecology and food sovereignty, and they are the solution to climate change. against the agribusiness and extractive industries. We know that the model is classist and racist and patriarchal, and that women are fighting to transform everything and to make changes. I will briefly talk about the statement from the People's Summit. As I was saying, these are the elements from the statement. In general terms, you can read the statement online, but I wanted to put the spotlight on what the People's Summit was telling to the COP in Madrid. We energetically condemned the COP25 because they didn't keep the conference under the presidency of the Chilean government. They kept it because it's a government that is responsible for assassinations and torture. So we wanted to see a change. So it would have been possible to withdraw the presidency. Also, the rejection of false solutions. This is present in our statement, especially those based on nature. And another important topic for us is that we want immediate action and targeted to prevent corporations from taking over negotiations. And this is happening in social and civil society spaces. We want more ambition from governments to make visible the migration induced by migration. This is a summary of the statement. My reflections, my feminist reflections, well, in the future, we said that the feminism needs to see the connections between extractivism, neoliberalism and capitalism. We have to put a focus on the reproductive and care work that women carry around all over the world, and we have to change the gender inequality. Something important in Latin America at this moment is that given the popular uprisings and the national uprisings in the region, states are responding with violence. In my country, we had an indigenous and popular uprising that was violently repressed and caused deaths and damages, and the narrative is becoming more and more intolerant towards diversity. They are more racist.
And against that backdrop, people are fighting against extractivism and for climate justice. And this is an important challenge for our region in the future. That was my intervention. Thank you for listening to me, and I'll be glad to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Mel. It's really been wonderful to hear the outcomes from the People's Summit and the work that was happening in Santiago. I know that this was a key priority for the constituency when the move was made, to make sure that the struggles, the voices, the demands that were coming from Chile, from Santiago, were being heard throughout and in the COP itself. And I wanted to say that we have a video actually that's coming out in the next couple of weeks, two videos at least, that try to show what some of the action visually looked like at the People's Summit and what visually actions look like at the COP, and how feminists in both of those spaces tried to echo and bring forward these demands. And I just wanted to say a few things in closing before we go to some of the questions. And I see some people have asked questions about slides being shared, and we for sure will share all of these slides and materials with you in wrap up to this call. But I think that, I think Melissa and Mel really raised a really stark reality of what we're facing in terms of the backlash and repression that movements around the world, particularly feminist movements, are facing in kind of a state of really rising right-wing extremism and rising pushback and violence against social movements. And for me in particular, and I think this was this experience of many, although I can't say that we've ever witnessed a COP where we achieved the transformative policy action that we desperately need to be able to combat climate change, it really, really felt like this COP was very divorced from the reality of the climate emergency in terms of the level of ambition, in terms of the fact that we're still squabbling over language on human rights and gender equality, and the fact that, you know, one of the biggest, what would Chile and other countries would see as one of the biggest failures of this COP was not establishing a market mechanism, which we in of ourselves do not think is actually a true and real solution for really challenging the climate emergency. So I think it's important to recognize that we're seeing a real disconnect between the multilateral process, which we very much think needs to be there and that we need to engage in, because it's critically important that we have all countries being held accountable to this climate crisis and to committing action and raising ambition towards the climate crisis, but that there's still such a disconnect between the reality of what's happening. And I think that what we're seeing in other spaces is, you know, it's providing this cognitive dissonance that we have, where we see, you know, at the same time that you have countries negotiating away rights and trying to make a piecemeal approach to climate action, and then you have Greta being named the Person of the Year by Time magazine. You see climate change is all the rage and the talk of Davos and other spaces, but to what end and in what actions and what does it really mean? And I think we felt this very, very clearly at the COP, where there was several unauthorized actions that took place on the inside, one of which there was hundreds of people who were part of this action who got pushed outside and they weren't allowed back in for the rest of the day. There were abuses that many of our constituencies felt in terms of saw in the reaction of the security to some of those actions. I witnessed an Indigenous woman who was outside begging to be let back inside because her child was inside and not allowed to. It was very scarring and very much reflective of the rest of the world. And in conversations that we had with the Secretariat following, trying to negotiate access back into this space, you know, one of the most jarring things was this idea that can you promise that this kind of action is not going to happen again? And you know, this idea that in a climate emergency where everyone around you is ignoring the fact that the world is burning and not taking action, that somehow it's the citizens that need to promise that they're not going to violently react to that. It's not that the countries need to be held accountable for, you know, not meeting their climate targets. It's that you have to follow the rules at all costs. Even if the world is burning around you, you can't, you know, break the glass to get a fire extinguisher because it's against the rules to do that. And I think it was one of the pieces where, you know, if even in this UN space, when there's actions and activities happening from civil society, that the crackdown we feel is swift and is violent and is authoritarian, and we can't model a space that understands peace and understands justice and allows for people's voices to be heard, understanding we're in this context of climate emergency, then how can we expect this to happen where we're seeing social uprisings around the world that are facing such a crackdown? And I share that reflection because I think it's a really important role for feminist movements to play in terms of pushing forward an understanding of resistance and what it looks like, how it's being modeled elsewhere, and how we push for it in other spaces that we work in. And I just wanted to share some of the pictures of actions. So this was a march that Feminists took part in Madrid on the Friday in the first week of the conference, where we echoed the song and dance of the Chilean feminists who have, their call to action is being echoed around the world, and was one of the largest contingents of this march, actually. We had actions on the inside in terms of protection of human rights and indigenous peoples, and intergenerational equity and gender equality being our red lines for what we wanted to see in the outcomes. This is some pictures from what I was just speaking about in terms of unauthorized actions where civil society was legitimately shut out, the door closed and pushed outside and corralled when they were raising their voices outside the plenary. And yeah, just kind of being present in every space to kind of continually remind the decision makers at the COP that they were forgetting not only about the emergency, but about people and the impacts that they're facing in this climate emergency. And because we were so frustrated with the way that the COP was going, it went over time 2 days, we had a really wonderful collaboration across civil society groups, from trade unions to indigenous peoples and youth and women. And we did an alternative COP closing, and you can find it on the WGC Twitter and on WeDo's and others. There's this clip of the final interventions of civil society. And there's certainly been times where we've done joint messaging before with other groups, but I've never felt that there was so much frustration and solidarity of, this is unacceptable in terms of where we are. And I think it's one of those pieces where movements need to get to that point to be able to find the spaces for solidarity. So in terms of what's next, I think that as much as we can continue following along with things like the Gender Action Plan and their implementation, we also need to be really working and building movement across the different regions, such as with our partners in Latin America, and bringing those demands forward in a unified way, but also across movements to be bringing a really strong feminist agenda for climate action for this year. And I think that's going to inform a lot of our decisions and mobilizing before COP26 and just throughout the year. So I see that Patricia's already starting to answer some questions in terms of the slides being shared, in terms of different questions that people had. I'm going to pass back to you, Patricia, since it seems you've read all the questions, in case there's any particular things you want to highlight from what you're writing. And if anybody else has questions, please feel free to add.
Connection. Hi, can you hear me now? It seems that I also lost internet connection for the second, in the second when Bridget was passing over to me. We had a couple of questions actually on the slides, and sharing the slides in particular, also to be able to access and read the manifesto again. And I really hope that this is kind of a basis that we can use also for forming feminist action and closing up with our movements together globally. That would be great. I hope that I have replied to the concrete questions that we got already in written on the expert group on loss and damage that was formed in the negotiations. It will only be formed now or created, established until the end of 2020, and then starts to work on an action plan that is looking at access to finance. To be very quick about that. And the other question was about gender analysis in Iran, and I'm sure that there is a big network in the Women and Gender Constituency and Advocacy Group that you could contact and is able to support. I would really encourage to really use the mailing lists also for those kind of purposes, because this is the way that we can connect and strengthen each other's work. So from this point, I do not see any more questions. Let me know if I forgot anything, but I don't see anything. We are certainly sharing the presentation and also the recording, so you can have a look again. And I just see another question. Discomfort with the technical fixes proposed in the space for geoengineering. I was wondering if there is a statement. So we do have feminist demands for each COP and also general demands of the Women and Gender constituency. And in those demands, we are also having one on geoengineering. So I'm happy to share that as well, that document as well, after the webinar or with sharing the slides. So I see already a lot of thank yous. So saying that, I would also like to thank the translators that made the translations into English, Spanish and French possible, and also allowed Mel and Antonio to speak and present in Spanish. Yeah, thanks so much for joining our webinar. I think it was the biggest of all 3 webinars. I really encourage you to be part of our mailing list, to work on the network and movements, and join our next call that will take place end of February, if you are civil society. So maybe I pass over to Bridget to just say goodbye in that regard. Could you hand over, Maike, please?
Thank you. So yeah, I saw there were 2 other pieces in here. One about preparing for the GAP for the SB in Bonn, which is coming up in June. So we, Patricia had created a very useful list of key dates and events that are coming up, as well as the key things that we need to prepare for in relation to the Gender Action Plan for Bonn. So we'll resend that, but just to say one of the pieces is around the role of the National Gender and Climate Change Focal Point, but we will definitely come back to this. And I think Ayutthef, I'm not quite sure what the question is. If I think it's about whether or not what would make something a robust gender action plan. But I'm happy to follow up with you on that if you have a very specific question. But other than that, thank you everyone, and we look forward to chatting with you on the mailing list.
Thank you very much, Bridget and Patricia. Thank you very much to all the participants and the interpreters. And I would like to wish you a very nice weekend, because that's ahead, a bit closer for some than for others. Thank you for joining, and see you next time. Ending the event now. Bye.